Welcome everybody to the dinner table seminar on narratives of migration at the 24th time of the Writer Festival. We are really happy to see you, and today I have the honor of moderating this particular panel. My names are Philippa Ann Namtevi Kabalikagwa, and I am a Ugandan South African storyteller and writer and author of memoir. Before I introduce my co-panelists, I need to say the thank yous to the people who sponsored us so that I don't forget them, because our conversation is just going to be really fun. I'd like to thank our partners and funders, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the National Department of Arts and Culture, the KZN Department of Arts and Culture, the French Institute of South Africa, the STAND Foundation, the Foundation for Human Rights, the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. I'd also like to thank the media partner, the Imbiza Journal for African Writing, and the technical partner, Hear My Voice, who are making this particular session possible. And we thank you for all the technical support. Okay, here we are. Representatives from Liberia and the Netherlands, the Philippines and the UK, South Africa. I'm going to start with a question that we start with in my home. When you come into a place as a stranger, we ask you, who are you and why are you here? And I'm going to start with Romalyn. Romalyn, who are you and why are you here?
Hi, it's so nice to finally meet you online, Philippa. My name's Romalyn. I grew up in the Philippines. I grew up with an absentee mother. My mother migrated to the UK initially to become a nurse in order to provide a better chance in life for us. And eventually, when I reached 16 years old, the whole family migrated with my mother to the UK. So I've been living here in the UK now for half of my life. And also, I'd like to say that apart from being a poet, I am also a nurse. So I've followed the footsteps of my mother. So I am a nurse poet.
Welcome, and we will really be interested in hearing your journey, both as someone who has migrated, as a second generation migrant, and also as a writer. I'm going to go to Vamba, Mike, because we belong on this soil. So Vamba, Sheriff, who are you and why are you here today? You're muted, Vamba. Can you please unmute first?
I am Vamba Sharif. I was born in Liberia, and at a certain point earlier in my life, I migrated to Kuwait, where I went to school, spoke Arabic, wore gowns like Arabs, and really integrated into that society. And at a certain point, I was compelled, because of circumstances, the Gulf War, to leave Kuwait and to come to the Netherlands as an asylum seeker, as a refugee, where I've been living for more than 20 years now.
Welcome, welcome. And we will be really interested to hearing your work and to hear what you have to share. Mike, welcome. Tell us who you are and why you're here.
Hello, my name is Mike Fangran, and I'm in Cape Town. I'm a playwright, and I guess I'm here because I'm a playwright and because this panel comprises a novelist and a poet, and playwrights are very seldom invited to literary festivals because we are not seen as being part of the literary crowd. So it's delightful to be here. Thank you very much. And I guess I'm here because I wrote a play that had the theme of migration. It was a play called When Swallows Cry. It was a commission from a Norwegian theatre company. And it was at a time when migration was a huge issue in Europe. And they had this relationship with China as a company, and they invited 8 playwrights from around the world to explore the theme of migration from their particular perspectives. There were 2 Norwegians, there were 2 Chinese, there was a Russian, an American, an Italian, and myself. And we walked into a bar. No, actually, we walked into 3 different Chinese cities over a period of a year, for a week at a time, working on our plays individually, but also with dramaturgs. And by the end of that year, we basically had constructed our respective plays dealing with the theme of migration. So we put on the play at the Market Theatre in early 2017. And so I guess on the basis of that, I'm taking part in this discussion today.
No, thank you. Welcome. And thank you for just sharing a little bit about your work as a playwright and how you got into the whole conversation about migration. And interesting, you had to travel out of the country to begin to write about the migration. Romelin, can you tell us a little bit more about your craft and your work and how it links to the theme of migration?
Yes, I have just recently published my debut poetry collection, Anti-Emetic for Homesickness. It came out last year with Chato and Windus. The topics that I am really passionate about are the topics of migration, and that is obviously because I am a migrant myself. My mother is a migrant. I came to the UK not as a child, not as a baby, but an actual adolescent. I was 16 years old. So I lost such richness of my home country. Just like Vamba said, I also had to assimilate to a new country. But most importantly, I guess the most important thing for me is my profession, my career as a nurse. And, you know, there's a lot of nurses all over the world. The Philippines is actually one of the biggest source of nurses for countries such as the UK, America, and also even in South Africa, there are a lot of Filipino migrants there, especially in the fishing industry in Kalk Bay. So I am very passionate to shed light on the culture and the career that I love, which unfortunately is not seen in the literary landscape, especially in the British literary landscape. It's very unseen. So we never really heard of stories about nurses, especially migrant nurses, even about nurses in general. There are very few nurse writers in the UK. What more when we think of migrant nurses? And it is quite a disappointment for me, and it was quite saddening to think that nurses have always been around, especially during this time of the pandemic. A lot of Filipino nurses, a lot of nurses from the from the Black and ethnic minority group have died during the pandemic. But the question is, do we really know their story? Do we really know so much about their narratives apart from them being healthcare professionals, being nurses? The difficulty is sometimes we just see the statistics, especially nowadays in COVID. We see so many nurses die every day. We see so many people die every day, but we forget that behind those statistics, they are human beings. And I'm passionate about. And therefore, that's the reason why I wrote Anti-Emetic for Homesickness. I mean, I didn't write it for COVID because obviously it was complete before COVID happened. But it's something that I've always been passionate about. And that's why this is what I'm bringing. And hopefully I could expand the British landscape by bringing something that has been unseen.
And the choice of your title, Anti-Emetic, for homesickness, you know, something that stops the nausea of homesickness. That was really, yeah. So I love the fact that your work is the intersection between, on one level, there's the whole question of the nurses and I think you've called them invisible women in part of this, the one of your poems, but there's also, I find the story of the child left behind, longing for the mother, but also I think there's the story of the migrant child who has left home, and now you're two generations of migrants. I think those themes come across as well in your poetry, and we'll speak a little bit more about that. Vamba, you have migration also as a core theme, I think, in a lot of your work, maybe most of your work. Could you speak a little bit about that? And can you unmute yourself, please?
Because I migrated early on in my life.
How old were you?
10, 11, I don't know. Yes. When I moved to Kuwait, it wasn't a difficult migration because I spoke Arabic before leaving for Kuwait, and it was also a very predictable, it's not the typical life of migrants with lot of uncertainties. I was in a secured world. I went to school. I had good food. I had good care. So you could say that migration was a very, very good one. I mean, I did not experience the typical migrant story of suffering and challenges. I didn't have that at all. But then everything changed at a certain point in my life when this war came in Kuwait. And I was confronted with this reality of war, and I had to survive. I actually lived under the occupation for like 4 months, from August to December, when I decided to flee the country. And that's when I saw an aspect of migration I have been reading about in novels and seeing on television. And it opened my eyes to the reality of life as a refugee, because then I became a refugee. And all of a sudden, and what was happening at the same time, there was war in Liberia. So the Liberia that I knew as a child, that very predictable, secure Liberian childhood, was gone with the war. You know, so I mean, and since then it's a struggle to belong. It's a struggle to reclaim that past. It's a struggle to reclaim that security that I had, that I lost with the first Gulf War. And that has had such a profound effect on my life and on my writings. Actually, my first novel was an attempt to reclaim the Liberian past, to reclaim that Liberia before the war. And so you see that most of my characters are actually moving. They are the main character in the novel leaves the United States, 19th century America, go to Africa to reunite with his beloved Charlotte. So it's a story of migration. And so what I did was to then equip my character with all the fears and uncertainties of migrant that I was then in the Netherlands, and during my flight from Kuwait to Europe. So it's through that experience I was able to write about migration, perhaps persuasively. Yeah.
Great. There are many themes that come up when we talk about migration, but I'd like people to experience your work. I think it's really important to hear the work of the writers in the room. And so I've asked each writer to read a short excerpt of their work. I am going to start with Romalyn and then go to Mike and then Vamba.
Yes. So I'll be reading a poem from Antiemetic for Homesickness. I mentioned a while ago that I grew up with an absentee mother who left the Philippines to work as a nurse. I guess this poem is my attempt to explore what it means to be exiled through employment, but also exiled emotionally. and what it means to find a sense of belonging in the names that are given to us when our parents are not there. Just before I read it, I know that we might have some audiences around the world, especially the Philippines. ANE in the UK is accident emergency, so it's basically an equivalent of ER or emergency room in the Philippines. And the word sister in nursing here in Britain means a charge nurse. So we address our supervisor or the charge nurse as a sister. Names. We are nameless and all names are ours. Emmanuel Lacaba. My mother's name is Rosana, but when she left, I had other mothers, Rowena, Jimboy, Alma. I was named after the first syllables of my parents. I will always have them with me. My mother says not all names have meaning. Riverside, Manila, London, Corba. And someday I will forget all the commands I did not heed, like the time I did not spin the plate clockwise before my father left for work, even if it would deliver him from accidents. Not all destinations are found in the junctions of your palm lines. Say better life. Say better life. And God knows I am repenting. Say Airbus something. Say one-way ticket. Keep following the sunset. Clouds are the closest things to my mother. Say United Kingdom. Say the Queen. NHS. Does winter always mean? Listen. Can you hear it? The loneliness of stretchers along A&E corridors. And the strongest part of me is the scar I hide underneath my French. My mother hides in the staff toilet to make long-distance calls. And someday I will realize the woman lonely in her mansion is not my mother, but a future version of myself. I will chop bitter guards on the galaxy glimmer of her worktop. Shall we shorten your name on your name tag so it's easier to remember? Say, yes, please, sister. Say, please, sister, can I take this call? Say Arnold Marcus Harold. Say septicemia, alcohol poisoning, hernia. Say Jason Darius Vernon. Say cancer, myocardial infarction. Query is schizophrenia. Hides in the toilet. And I have the first syllables of my parents' names. That is why I am not scared. A boy sticks out his tongue and says, I do not have a mother. I punch him in the face. The sanctity of blood. I am not scared because my mother has followed the sunset, because she has burnt her lips on mash and gravy in a 3-minute lunch break, because she calls me anak, my child, my baby. She asks, what do you want for Christmas, for your birthday? 1990 remains stuck on the other line. Say, please, sister, can I take this call? My breasts blossom. She can call me only by my name. I have the first syllables of my parents' names. That is why I am not scared. I can track the mountain of Makulot, my father's rifle hanging from my back. I can carry myself not how someone carries a cytotoxic drug, but how my mother hooks with her finger a drain bottle with blood clots, the weight of gemstones. I will read one more poem. Filipinos is the third most common nationality of NHS staff. But with regards to most common migrant nationality, we actually came second. The first, the top nationality is the Indians. In the US, 4% of the nursing staff are Filipinos. It is big considering that Filipinos make up only 1% of their population. So a while ago, I was talking about how sometimes we are so invisible in this landscape. I mean, last summer when we were on lockdown and the British people decided to clap for us at certain hour of the day to actually show their appreciation for the NHS. That's really great, and we really appreciated it. But it's as if there were only moments when we should be acknowledged, and I don't think it should be that way. I think nurses, especially migrant nurses, should be acknowledged every single day, not just when society choose for you to be remembered. So the next poem that I'm going to read is for all the invisible women. Invisible women. You see them everywhere, these invisible women. One navigates the ache of a corridor and the hour glints with a salvo of needles. A still intubating stylet enters the mouth like a forced prayer. On the news, an invisible woman fell asleep on the steering wheel and somersaulted into daybreak, debris glittering across the motorway. A splinter buries deeper. She speaks to her patient about his petunias, but doesn't mention the blooms of tumors on his endoscopy scan. They are everywhere, though some hazier than others. Flick through their passports to find only a page, their names and countries erased by sun rays. These invisible women, goddesses of caring and tending, but no one hears when their skulls pound like coconut shells about to crack. My mother walks to work when the sky is black and comes out from work when the sky is black. Her footsteps leave a snowdrop-studded path. In the middle of a plaza, she pauses, the downpour tricking her eyes to believe the statue in the square is a fellow invisible woman. Once, my mother cut through the blurred backs of men towards a gasping child and found a blade of grass fluttering in his throat. The air opened and she was gone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you really do touch on the themes of, you know, the migrant worker and how visible or invisible they are. And you also touch on the intersection between women and migrancy, you know, and how that comes across. The power of names and naming, those are some of the things I think when all of you are finished, it'd be interesting to talk about the power of names. I like that I'm not scared because of my name, you know, and how knowing who you are grounds you. I could go on, but I'm going to invite Mike to share something. And I think what is really interesting, Mike, for me is I mean, while Romalyn is telling a story that is her story and she lives so viscerally in that story, you are telling stories that you have observed. But I will let you say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so maybe just to contextualize what I'm going to be reading. I was the only African that was part of the group of playwrights commissioned to do plays about Africa. And I don't make my living as a playwright because that's impossible to do in South Africa. I work in the area of cultural policy and activism and so on. And through the work that I've done, and I've worked quite extensively across the African continent through the African Arts Institute, and then also an organization called Artefacts Network. And so I've traveled a little bit on the continent. And so I've become very concerned about the position of Africa within the world and particularly the issue of mobility and the ironies around, for example, when Africans were basically forced to leave Africa as slaves and are taken away to go and drive economic growth in the US and in Europe and in other European colonies. And now that Africans, a few hundred years later, want to sell their labor voluntarily on the international market, they are not exactly the most popular workers. And you know, the whole thing about mobility, inequality is a big part of what I kind of try to deal with in the work that I do. Inequality with regard to passports. So, you know, if you have a Singaporean or a European passport, you can go to about 170 countries without needing a visa. I think the top African country is probably something like Mauritius or Seychelles, where you can go to maybe about 120 countries. But the average African country, you can travel to about maybe 70 countries without needing a visa or without, getting a visa on arrival. So although in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we all supposedly are born equal, the reality of our world now is that we are completely unequal. And so the work that I've tried to do with When Swallows Cry tries to explore those themes, and it tells 3 different stories. One is about 2 Zimbabweans who flee Mugabe's Zimbabwe, and they want to go to Fiji because that's one country where they can be for 3 months without needing a visa. But on their way there, in the ship that they are part of, the ship veers into Australian waters, and so they get captured, put into a detention center, and their experiences comprises one story. Another story is about a Somalian who basically walks from Somalia to flee the conflict there, comes to South Africa, and because he's Somalian and from elsewhere, the way that South Africans treat people from other parts of the continent is really violent. And so he has experienced this violence, and so he gets a visa to go to America. And on his arrival there, he gets confronted by immigration officials. One of them, ironically, is an African-American, a descendant of slaves, who is now at the port of entry, and his job is to manage people coming into his country. And so here he is, having been forcibly removed from Africa, he's now at the forefront of preventing other Africans from coming into the country, and so the conflict there. But the excerpt I'm going to be reading from is really what is the core part of the play, which is there's a guerrilla group on the border of Nigeria and Cameroon. And they basically not specialized, but one of the ways in which their economy works is that they capture Westerners who happen to be in their country, and then they hold them for ransom. And this particular group, they have captured a Canadian teacher who has come to do good in their country. They don't see it like that. They see him basically as a commodity, and they hold him for ransom, and they're going to sell him to Boko Haram because Boko Haram has much greater kind of infrastructure, and they will make lots of money that way, and they will then be able to drive development in the little village of which they are part. So the characters in this piece are Commandant, who is the leader of the guerrilla group, and his sidekick, Soldat, and then the Canadian, whose name is Charles. And so Charles is there captured, and Commandant is now speaking to him, and you'll see the difference. It's a bit more difficult to read 2 characters, but I'll try. And so Commandant basically is speaking to Charles. He has his passport in his hand. You travel many countries, Morocco, Jamaica, Israel, Japan, Chile. You teach all these? No. You CIA? Those were mostly holidays. Commandant speaks to Soldat. He traveled the world for fun. He rich, Soldat. We get good price for him. Please, sir, you can see I'm not American. I'm of no value to you. You white, you have name, you have value. Soldat and me, we know value. The world know us. I shoot him, no one cries. I shoot you, I start a war. Commandant goes to Charles's rucksack and he takes out a play, a book. It's the play called Hamlet that Charles is teaching to the kids in this particular village. What is this? Says Commandant. It's a play, Hamlet. What is Hamlet? It's the name of the prince in the story. What story? The book tells the story about a prince. His uncle kills his father, the king, and marries his mother, and his uncle becomes the king. Where this happened? In Denmark, Europe. It's a well-known story by a very famous playwright. Equiano wrote this? Equiano? You know no Olodao Equiano? Very famous writer. Hamlet was written by William Shakespeare. He Danish? English. You teach this book to us children? Yes. Soldat, you see they teach? Kill brother, marry sister, become king. Then when we do like they teach, they say, we barbarians. They teach us children about brother who kills king to become king. Then they say to us, no kill government, do democracy. Only way for change king here is kill him. They send you, excuse me, the British, the old slave martyrs, they send you here? No. They send you, no. Before they take us bodies, now they send you to kidnap us children's minds. New slavery, free body, colonized mind. Learn new language, know your stories, worship you, God. No, I applied to this company and they gave me options to choose Asia or Africa. I chose Africa. You chose Africa. Soldat, he chose Africa. Which you choose, Soldat? Europe or America? Australia or Canada? Which you choose, Soldat? That's right, Soldat. You, me, no have choice. But he chose Africa. So that's kind of the one excerpt. And then there's another where Commandant is speaking to Soldat and he says, I'm going to teach you about inflation. Once upon a time, they make us history. They come to Africa, kidnap your uncles, Commandant's aunties, tie them with chains and take them on boats to Europe, to America, against their will. And they sell them $1 for your boy cousin, $2 for Commandant's brother, 50 cents for your boy cousin. Now they come back for us gold, us trees, us oil. But now we make them history. We kidnap them and we sell them $1 million to Boko Haram, 500,000 Lord's Army, 750 Al-Shabaab. $1 for your African sister 300 years ago, Soldat. $1 million for American today. That, Soldat, is inflation. So, yeah, that's basically, you know, that theme kind of runs through the course of the play. And as I said, basically creating a framework to comment on the other stories about this inequity with regard to who is allowed to travel and how people from the African continent are still viewed in very kind of racist paradigms internationally.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. And you raised the whole question of power, which is a really interesting question also in the whole thing of migration. And for me, you know, it made me think of who is called a migrant. You know, you get someone called a migrant and then someone's called an expatriate, an immigrant versus an expatriate. For me, they're all immigrants or migrants, but you know, when a European comes to Africa, they're an expatriate. When an African goes, you're a refugee, you're an asylum seeker. So yes, really interesting parallels, which we will continue with, but let's hear something from Vamba's work. I'm not sure if he's going to share his multilingual expertise or if he's going to read to us in English. I wait with bated breath. Do whatever makes you happy.
I could give it a try. I could give it a try. I'm actually going to comment on what Mike said about Africans who were kidnapped and shipped to the West and sold for $1. I'm going to read an excerpt from the very beginning of my first novel about the descendants of one of those people who then decided to decides to return to Africa, to the newly founded Black Republic, Liberia. One morning, on a wet autumn day, I caught sight of the ship in the distance and hurried towards it. The salty sea air bore excited voices towards me, and it was not long before I became part of the bustle. Shouldering my luggage consisting of clothes, some valuable books, and expedition materials, I climbed on board. The ship was crowded with men and women. There were no children. Among the passengers were carpenters, stonemasons, tailors, and a preacher. But the last was not the only one there who had embraced the word of the Lord. Seated or standing in groups, the men reveled in dreams of a better life in a republic with abundant land and the opportunity to establish a trade. Nowhere in the wide world was the freedom desired by Blacks of America fulfilled more than in the coastal republic of Liberia. As I edged my way to the berth that would be my abode for the coming weeks, I heard those dreams being exchanged with conviction and hope. Although I did not participate in these conversations, my dreams differed from all the others. I cherished freedom and had longed for it all my life. But that was not why I was heading for Africa, for the land of the fathers. What made me trade America with all its promises for a distant shore was perhaps greater than freedom. The ship set sail out of the crowded dock with the Atlantic winds guiding it, where wishes in their dozens waved from the pier, but I chose not to wave back. I was resolved to put America and everything about it behind me and to forge a new beginning for myself. Yet, how could I escape from it all? The fields, the great house, Sarah, and the large country where I had spent so much of my life. That's the first chapter from Land of My Fathers. And it tells the story of Edward Richards and the challenges of founding a new republic when the rest of Africa was either being colonized or being divided among Europeans. A very challenging period because those who returned home, Africa, they've been dreaming about, longing for throughout the centuries. Those people were very different people. Although they were black, their skin were black, but they were more Americans than Africans. And so it was very challenging to then interact with the African brothers and sisters they met in Africa. And they thought that the future of Liberia, of that new republic, lay in trying to convince the African brothers and sisters to embrace the American way of life, to become Christians, to become westernized. And so there was this tension between the two group of people, brothers and sisters. There was this tension which resulted in a lot of misunderstanding between the two group of people and resulted, I believe, a century and a half later in this bloody civil war. A very tragic situation because they returned home to Africa with good intentions. They were going home to be with their brothers and sisters, but they've changed. They were other, and this is what that's what migration is. You are not the same when you migrate. It was Christopher Okigbo who said it well in one of his poems. We carry into our words that have flourished, our words that have failed. So there were so many things that they brought with them that they were very different. They were only African in skin, but very American in otherwise. So I try to deal with these tensions in the novel, but it's also a novel of hope because I'm an optimistic person. And I've seen the other side of migration, the other side of human beings, the good side. So there is a novel of friendship. Edward Richards arrives in Liberia, 19th century Liberia, and meets a remarkable man, Harley, a man who was inspired by another story, a legend that is alive in Liberia. There was this threat of war among a people in northern Liberia, present-day Liberia. And so the oracle ordained that someone had to voluntarily sacrifice himself or herself to avert that war. And so according to legends, this man came forward and said, I'm going to do it. I hate war so much. I don't want my people to be confronted with war. So I'm going to sacrifice myself to stop war. So this Christ, almost a Messiah kind of character, came forward and did this and offered himself to stop war. And this, I grew up hearing this story and it inspired me so much. So I decided, all right, being a novelist and everything in a novel is possible. So I created this friendship between this American who was born and bred in slavery, who had left, came to Liberia, met this man, and they became friends. So it's a novel of friendship. Yes.
Yeah, yes. So many threads that are interacting for me. You know, the connection between Mike's story and Vamba's story, and the way Vamba also, you know, Edward also travels for love. So, you know, the whole thing is, why do people migrate?
Yes.
People migrating for work, people migrating so their children can have a better life.
Yes.
But this one man migrating because he is going to meet the love of his life, whereas the rest are migrating to go and start a new nation. There's the whole thing of underneath all of this is the whole question of belonging and longing. You know, people long for something that makes you move. And then when you move in the new world, you're constantly trying to belong. And when you come back home, you realize you don't belong. So can we have a conversation about this whole thing of belonging and longing, and how you work with it as writers, how you share pictures and images, and how does it flow in your work?
I'm very curious to know what Rumaling experience of belonging has been, because you left the Philippines when you were 16 years old.
Yeah.
And then have you been back? I'm very curious to the Philippines. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that this topic could be really extended, and we could be spending the whole night talking about this, because it's very expandable. For me, as someone who grew up, in particular as a child of a migrant nurse, I feel that my life has always been a series, or perhaps an endless series of endless packing and unpacking. I mean, the story or the narrative that I'm trying to explore in Antimetic for Homesickness is not entirely unique to me. When I was writing the book in 2018, there are 9 million left behind children in the Philippines when their parents went abroad to work. We also see it especially in countries like China or Malaysia, Thailand, all over the world, really, especially in third world countries. We see a lot of children who are left behind. It is actually a phenomenon. And there are quite a lot of research on how being a left behind child affects that child emotionally, and affects them in a way that strengthens them as well, not just breaks them. So while you were talking about your narrative of hope, Vamba, a while ago, I was really, I could really relate to it, because I feel that the narrative of migration, even though there's a breakage, even though there is a sense of fracture, there will always be a sense of healing as well. So despite pain, there will also always be healing. There are a few poems in my book that explores what it means to belong. Because particularly when we, after settling in a new land, for example, with me, after settling in the UK, I cannot really 100% say that I belong here, because at the end of the day, I didn't grow up here. But also, I cannot 100% say that I belong in the Philippines, because the Philippines has changed massively since I left. So that sense of belonging is quite difficult for us to attain. There's no one place that we could certainly call home anymore. And I'm not sure if it's the same with you, Vamba, or the same with you, Mike. Mike, that really belonging is something that will always kind of try to chase after, but it's very difficult to attain. It's as if we're always longing for belonging in a way, like what Philippe was saying. What do you, I mean, what do you think? How do you feel about it?
I yes,
Mike?
I've struggled. I've struggled with the concept of belonging all my life. I mean, when I moved to Kuwait, I at a certain point I thought I belong uh, within that society, but then things, certain experiences on a daily basis made me to realize, no, I mean, I'm still that African child. And then, yes, I left Kuwait and I came to the Netherlands, where I'm being asked this question that Philippa asked, where do you come from, in the very beginning, So this is the questions that people are asking me all the time. And when am I going back? Even after 20 years of living in Holland, I'm being asked that question on a daily basis by people who have known me for all these years. They are still thinking, oh, Famba, I mean, he speaks Dutch, he writes in Dutch, but perhaps one day he's going to pack his luggage and he's going to go back to where he came from. When in fact I left Liberia as a child. That Liberia that I left doesn't exist anymore. So see, this sense of belonging, indeed, is a longing to belong, that we're continuously struggling with. And I think this is what that led me to write my memoir in the first place, because what I wanted to do is, my daughter was born here. She's not experienced Africa or Liberia. She's never been there. So I decided, oh, why don't I write about my childhood? Why don't I write about my life with my mother, the mother that she didn't get to know, the mother that passed on in the war. So it's a kind of love letter to my daughter, but also a letter, a memoir in which I try to write especially about the values that formed me. That was the challenging aspect of writing the memoir. What do I have here, as someone who is always trying to belong? What do I have to give to my daughter? In terms of values, in terms of stories that formed me, because we are, according to Simbin Usman, the great novelist and cineast, we are stories, or we are formed by stories.
Yes.
So the stories that formed me, I wanted to share these stories with my daughter. So this is why I decided to write this letter to her. So it's a letter. I go back to my childhood, and I couldn't stop there, because my life didn't stop there. I went to Kuwait, so I wrote about my life in the Arab War too. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Just listening to the two of you, I can so relate, because I grew up in Uganda. We left for Kenya, and I've lived in many African countries. And in fact, I wrote my memoir, Flame and Song, because I turned 50 and I was here, and I realized I'd lived in Cape Town longer than I'd lived anywhere else, and my parents had passed away, and I said, who am I? And I went back. And in that process for me, I wanted to talk about the power of place, geography, the physicality, because migration is really about moving from place to place. And I think we plant roots in places, but there's something very powerful about land, and stepping on land and feeling like you belong to land also, or not. And I think, Mike, even you in your story, the one story is situated the commandant story actually is situated in a forest somewhere where the people are, and people are working for their village and the mine and the land and, so, I'm just wanting to I want us to have a conversation about place and the power of place and all the places that, that affect us as people begin to talk about migration. How do you begin to call a place home? What is it about place that situates you? And what is it about sometimes traveling into a land where you've never been and you've never belonged, and stepping into land and suddenly realizing that I could live here, maybe I belong in this particular land, and then going somewhere else and really feeling like I don't belong here. I don't know if any of you have experienced that at
Yes,
all.
I have. I had this
Yeah.
uncanny feeling when I traveled to Durban, that I really deeply, affectionately belonged to Durban. I mean, the very first day when I got there, it's strange that I had this. I've never had it before when nowhere else in the world. Why did I have that feeling that I belong to that city, that I belong to the streets of Durban? Why? It didn't leave me, throughout the period when I was there. It's very, very strange, but I felt it. I felt it, and I told everyone who wanted to listen that really, really, I feel I belong here. Yes, perhaps it could have changed after a while, but I had this intense feeling during the period when I was there.
And was it about being in the city? Was it about being near the sea? Because, when I think of Liberia, I think of the ocean, I think of sand, and I think that they're coastal lands. So
no, not the sea, because I grew up in northern Liberia. We had two rivers, so it's not the sea. I think I don't know. I heard that I was told that Durban was subtropical. I don't know. It has to do with the weather, perhaps. I don't know. But I had this. I mean, I've been to other countries before. I didn't have that when I was in Guinea. I didn't have them when I was in Sierra Leone, in Egypt, or elsewhere. Why Durban? Why?
Come back and find out.
Yes.
Mike, would you like to say something about place and the power of place? And,
Yeah, so obviously my experience is not that of a migrant in terms of, or a refugee or a person traveling between different countries, but as Vamba and Ramadan and you, Philippa, were speaking about, your experiences, it's a weird thing, but I've kind of felt that in South Africa, having grown up under apartheid, where we were kind of divided as people into different kind of racial categories. I mean, one of the reasons why I got into drama, ironically, was because in apartheid South Africa, I was classified colored, right? So I wanted to go to the University of Cape Town to study because I thought they offered the best education, and in terms of where I lived in Cape Town. But that was basically a university for white people, and so I had to apply for a permit from the Department of Colored Affairs to go to the University of Cape Town. And I had to do a subject not offered at the university that the apartheid authorities set up for me, which was the University of the Western Cape. And so my permit subject was drama. So I had to do drama as a major subject. I wouldn't have chosen drama, necessarily. So I always kind of say, if I'm a bad playwright today, you have to blame it on apartheid, because I would not have studied drama had I not wanted to go to the University of Cape Town and have to apply, on the basis of drama as my permit subject. But I'm telling you the story because, in a way, going to a place like University of Cape Town, it was overwhelmingly white. I mean, the demographics of the university now are fundamentally different. But when I was a student there were less than 10% of us who were people of color. So this was very much a different place, and you felt othered, everything about the place, the architecture, the pictures on the wall, the way people spoke, and so on, was different to what my experience was. And I think that's kind of often been my experience within this country. It's about migrating between different experiences. And you often are wondering, who are you? And of course, you take on identities that are of a political nature. Like, at that time, we grew up under the shadow of Steve Biko, and we identified ourselves as being Black. And then post-apartheid South Africa, what does that mean to be Black now, you know? And so it's always these things. Identity politics is such a big thing in our country and globally today. So one is, as I say, constantly, you know, choosing identities or migrating between identities and migrating between places where one feels comfortable and uncomfortable. I feel sometimes more comfortable outside of my country in other parts of Africa than I do inside South Africa, because of the way that my friends from other parts of the continent are treated here. And it's that kind of, you know, you're constantly, as an individual, are faced with these challenges of being, of who you are and how you like to think of yourself within particular spaces. And you're constantly being challenged to re-identify or reimagine yourself. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting kind of thing where we are not, I'm not necessarily traveling between countries, but I am traveling between different identities and different spaces that try to shape my identity. And then I've got to construct, well, who am I within those identities? The very first question that you asked, Philippa, who are you and why are you here? I guess it's a question that one is still grappling with.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes to the end, but we were told that actually there is nothing happening after our talk. So we do have the liberty of about 15 more minutes if you guys really want to continue. So I'm just checking with you if you'd like to continue the conversation, and I would like to end with each one of you reading some work, or do you want to end? We continue, sharp, cool. There we go. Vamba, you're speaking, yes, and you're muted.
To read something.
I love that.
Yes, I wanted to read something. Just a paragraph from in Dutch from my memoir.
All right. What can I just say? Can you, before you do that? I think what we will do in terms of closing is we will each say something about what the conversation has meant to us today. And then each one will read something as part of the closing. I might read a little bit myself just because I want to throw myself in, if that's okay with you guys. So really just, can I just first ask, okay, Vamba, what are you taking out of this conversation? Just a brief input, and then we'll go to Mike, and then we'll go to Romelin, and then we will go into reading something, if you want, to share a farewell piece to our listeners.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. How rich is the migrant experience? I mean, I'm sitting here and then hearing Romaline and Mike. You are sharing very rich stories of your experience in the Philippines, in England, in South Africa. And I've told you about my life in Kuwait and a bit in the Netherlands. I think migrants have really defined the trajectory of history, and we are the one who make history. So although being a migrant nowadays is not popular, but migration has been part of human life from the very beginning. Yes, it is defined history as it is. So it's very good to be a migrant. I'm privileged to be a migrant and to share my migrant stories with the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I suppose.
Thank you, Vamba. Mike, would you like to?
Yeah, one of the things that I've taken away from this discussion is, I was saying earlier that one of the areas that I work within and that shapes a lot of the work that I do is inequality, which I think is one of the major fault lines in the world today. But I think the other major fault line in the world is culture. The different value systems that people have, the different belief systems, the different ways we make sense of the world. And I think one of the major reasons why migrants and refugees encounter the kinds of challenges that they do when they try to flee to Europe or other global north countries is not only on the basis of how they look, but because of the ignorance of the people within those particular land masses of the culture and the values of the people coming in, and they feel threatened by that. You know, you're Muslim, you believe differently, and because of that, we identify you as being other. And I was interested in terms of what Vamba was saying about, you know, going and acquiring a set of values and a set of beliefs elsewhere, and coming back and trying to you know, say to people, hey, you need to adopt these. And it's a little bit of what the story that I was reflecting on a little earlier was trying to say, that here you are bringing your Shakespeare and taking people's minds and reshaping them in accordance with the value systems of the global north. And it's so much about the notion of power, which is what you referenced early on as well, Philippa, that in a way people are obliged to follow laws, you know, the politics and economics and the military and the police oblige us to do certain things through coercion. But culture is the way in which our hearts are won, our minds are kind of influenced. And this is why where we work in literature, in theater, in music and the like, it's such an important area of either reinforcing hegemonic kind of value systems or challenging them. And I think that that's kind of where we are located, that it's not only because of our experiences as migrants or as people facing conflicts around identity and the like, that part of the privilege that we have as artists is to be interrogating that through our work and to be challenging people and providing catharsis as well. So I think that that's kind of one of the themes that has emerged from this for me.
Thank you. Romelin.
Yes, I really feel privileged by with being on this platform. I mean, I'd always go back to what Vamba was saying about privileges. I mean, migrants, like any other human being, they always go after something that motivates them, whether it's physiological need, your need for water, shelter, clothing, whether it's safety needs or your need for a sense of love and belonging, or your need for actual self-actualization. And I think most of the time migrants are viewed as someone who is lacking something. You know, they left their country because they couldn't provide for their family, particularly in anti-emetic for homesickness. The nurse mother couldn't provide a better chance in life for her family, so she has to leave her country. So migrants, they left their country because their country themselves couldn't provide safety for them. So there's always that common denominator of migrants are underprivileged. But when we think about it, to be honest, migrants, the only privileged thing that migrants have is the privilege of being a migrant. Because like what Mike is saying, we are then imbued in this very extensive experiences of what it means to be a human being, what it means to create an actual sense of identity for us, a sense of place for us, a sense of belonging for us. And I think talking about sense of place and sense of identity, I think it's something that is not static. It will always evolve as migrants travel throughout the world. So I feel privileged as well being a migrant.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, as we were talking, we've really focused on, you know, for example, in my journey in migranthood, I have created families and I have found local families. I've had to find grandmothers here for my children and aunties and uncles who are not blood aunties and uncles, but they're South Africans who live here, or people from other parts of the world who then become family. And there's that richness also of experience. We could go on and on and on, so I'm not going to go much deeper into this because it's an incredibly evocative and powerful topic. I'm going to ask each one of you to read something. We haven't even spoken about your choice of medium, you know, poetry, the novel. And I know that Vamba also dabbles in film and dabbles in journalism, and Mike is the activist. You know, I know even right now he's really involved in certain platforms here in South Africa. But as a closing, I'd like you to take a little something to share so that our audience leaves with the taste of your words in their ears. And as we spoke, Mike thought we should end with the poet. So I'm wondering, should Mike go first and then Vamba and then Romelin, or will that work? I see two heads nodding. Mike, how do you feel about that?
I feel fine. I'm not going to read from the play. In fact, I'm going to read a poem, so that if that's okay, I'm happy to go now. Yep. Okay. So this was a poem I wrote a number of years ago, and I've been speaking about the theme of xenophobia and so on. And it's a poem that, in a way, you know, rips off a very famous speech by the former president Thabo Mbeki, "I'm an African." It was written at a time when Mugabe was still in power in Harare and Zuma was in power in Pretoria. So some of the references might be for that. So it's called "I'm an African." I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, and the ever-changing seasons that define one face of my native continent, from which I would flee if I had the means. Am thinking of fleeing, have now fled. For another face is of power incontinence, a president for life in Harare, killer presidents in Khartoum, Nairobi, Bujumbura, a thief president in Pretoria, rulers without shame. Now I am a president without the P, abroad. Once taken to lands far away in chains against my will, now refused entry to self-same lands as someone free, yet not free to travel freely. Still, I am a professor in New York, a musician in Paris, a footballer in Spain, a car guard in Cape Town. I am an African. I'm a pin-up girl for famine, a poster boy for AIDS, a cover girl for terror, the face of a charity concert, though made faint by Syrian tears. I'm a runaway from hunger, an asylum seeker from war, a self-imposed exile from poverty, a refuge from false prophets of a better life now reserved for only a few. My body tells horror stories of white violence, of black hatred, of green envy, of red ideology, of rainbow-colored exclusion, of orange flames, of silver bullets, and rusted brown machetes. I am an African. I'm an optimist, I'm a pessimist, a socialist, a capitalist, an idealist, a pragmatist, a revolutionary, a conformist. I love, I live, I laugh, I cry, I hurt, I weep, I get sick, I die. I'm black, I'm blacker, and then some. I am an African. But see me foremost, see me first, see me as human. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to read a short paragraph from the very beginning of a memoir. And it goes like this. Naamgenoot van mijn moeder. Je hebt mij onlangs gevraagd het leven van je oma en de omgeving waarin we leefden tijdens mijn kinderjaren voor je op te tekenen. Je wilde weten hoe ik zonder haar verzaaid ben geraakt in het deel van de wereld waar jij je jeugd doorbrengt. Je verzoek ontstond naar aanleiding van een tekening. Je had haar naam, die ook jouw naam is, op een wit papier geschreven. Met kleurpotloden had je als achtergrond een gele zon, een groene boom en een helder blauwe lucht getekend. Je plaatst mijn moeder in het zomerseizoen in het licht van het leven, om dit tafereel vervolgens van dit bijzonder verzoek vergezeld te laten gaan. Ik was verrast, maar ook blij dat je me dit vroeg. So what I'm doing here is actually telling my daughter why I'm writing this letter. One day she asked me to tell her the story of her grandmother. The grandmother she didn't get to meet because of the war. And she had written the name of her grandmother, which is actually her name, on this piece of paper and colored it. And so this was actually the reason why I wrote this memoir. You know, as a remembrance of my childhood and the things that I did, the values that shaped me in Liberia and in Kuwait. And so that's just to give you a taste of what I wrote in Dutch. Thank you.
Thank you, Bamba. I'm going to read one poem again from Antiemetic for Homesickness. When I came to the United Kingdom at 16, a border officer at the airport looked into my baggage and he found a pickled mango, which was given to me by my auntie in the Philippines. And basically he took it in the bin. So I couldn't go past the border officer. I couldn't go into the United Kingdom unless that pickled mango is thrown away. And at that time I thought, how dare you do that? You weren't the one who actually planted that mango and pick it when it's ripe and pickle it for us. So this poem that I'm going to read attempts to explore what it means to leave things in our homeland. What do we leave behind? But also, what do we take with us? The making of a smuggler. Wherever we travel, we carry the whole country with us. Our rice terraces are folded garments. We have pillars of trees, a rainforest on a hairbrush. We dig alimasag crabs out of sand and use them as tabs to zip our bags. We immigrants are experts in packing. It's in our genes. If the border officer stops us, let him dive into our belongings like a man trying to fish in an ocean ruled by sharp corals, stinging anemones. Let the smell of old socks swirl up like bats. He can squeeze the yellow packet harder and not know it is pig's blood. He won't hear the squeal as he chokes it aside. He wasn't there, mud-soaked in a pen, chasing after the erratic swine. The officer might ask, "No sauce, no chicken feet?" with a broken accent, as if it would be easier for us to understand. But he can't smell my hands, see the sediments under my nails, fermented fish and all we dip in it. He can't cup his ear with my palm and hear the surfs of Siargao Beach. He can't follow me through the gate, even with his gaze. He'll miss the gleam of a red quill in my lugso, as when he didn't hear my uncle's knife grin back and forth on a whetstone, or how he slit the neck of my rooster to teach me about survival. The officer did not feel the pot of hot water getting lighter when I poured it over the carcass. He wasn't there at that moment where I ripped out the feathers I once used to caress. Thank you.
Ah, what a sumptuous dinner we have had. Thank you so much for being here, for writing, for speaking the voice of the migrant in different ways, for your poetry, for your plays, for your novels. Thank you for coming and sitting around the table with me. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world, thank you so much to Romalyn Ante. She is the author of Antiemetic for Homesickness. Mike Fangran, he is the author of 35 plays, but he read from When Swallows Cry. And Vamba Sharif, who has written many, many novels. His first one that he read from was Land of My Fathers, but he is translated into about 5 or 6 other languages. And he has a memoir coming out next month in Dutch. We'll be waiting for the English translation. We are waiting for it, Vamba, we are waiting because it really sounds beautiful. And just the format of letters, I miss writing letters. To all of you who are sitting there in the Zoom call with us and who are streaming, thank you so much. And Hear My Voice, thank you for holding the space for us so that we could have this conversation. Enjoy the rest of the festival and have a great evening. Good night.